Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Greg Moses. I am editor of the Acorn Journal, Philosophical Studies and Pacifism and Nonviolence, and communication coordinator for Concerned Philosophers for Peace. Today, the Concerned Philosophers for Peace is pleased and honored to welcome you to a launch of Joseph Orosco's brand new book, Star Trek's Philosophy of Peace and Justice, a global anti-racist approach, published by Bloomsbury. Joining this afternoon is the author of the book, Dr. Orosco. Welcome, Dr. Orosco.
Thank you, Greg. I'm happy to be here, and I'm grateful for everyone here.
We're really excited to share your work with our audience today. I wonder if you could, before we start, tell us a little bit about what you're wearing.
Well, this is, I suppose, my favorite uniform. This is the classic gray from the later seasons of Deep Space Nine. In the background here, you have the Ops Central from Deep Space Nine. And so this is one of my very first uniforms, one of my favorite uniforms, because I got married in this uniform. So I actually was officially made a married person in this outfit. So I wore it today for a special occasion.
Excellent. Well, we're honored that you picked that particular uniform to share with us today. Before we talk to you about your brand new book, would you please introduce yourself? Tell us a little bit about how you came to be the author of a book about Star Trek and philosophy.
Well, so thank you. Let me say, first of all, thank you to you, Greg, and to some of the commentators who are going to be here a little bit later, Andrew Fiala, Jen Kling, and also to Court Lewis, colleagues of mine from Concerned Philosophers for Peace, and people who I've known for a very long time, people who I consider to be colleagues and mentors in many of my scholarly pursuits. I want to thank them all for being here, for organizing this, and thank you to Concerned Philosophers for Peace for having this session. And thank you all to everyone who's come in from all around the United States, and otherwise, if you're out from outside of the United States, please let us know. But this book was a real, I mean, one, it was my COVID project, so I didn't know what to do with myself during quarantine. So I can't say that, I started watching more Star Trek, because I always watch Star Trek. It's sort of my go-to thing. But I started teaching a class in 2016 about the social and political philosophy and the ethics of Star Trek in celebration of the 50th anniversary of the network premiere of Star Trek. And I taught this at OSU, and I've been teaching it for a few years. And just, I use the episodes both as illustrations of philosophical theories, particularly ethical theories. But I started to think too that Star Trek had a point of view. That is, that it was articulating a certain kind of vision, both of the nature of humanity and the possibilities of the future for humanity. And I started to realize that this was a coherent story over 50, 60 years of storytelling over several different series. There was a canon, there was a body of reference that was self-referential, which I call the Star Trek universe. And I started to think that there were lessons here, and particularly lessons about the nature of peace and the nature of living in a just society and building a just future. And so this was something that had, I'm a Star Trek fan from a little kid. This was something, like I talk about in the book, it was something special between my mother and I. We would spend Saturday evening or Sunday evenings after the news at 10 p.m. We would wait for Star Trek in syndication reruns to come on. And that was always a special time for me, is just to be able to end the weekend, get ready for the next week by thinking about some kind of lesson that was coming out of Star Trek. And so I've watched all of this series. I continue to watch all of the series regularly, and I started to think there's something here that needs to be said, I think, for peace and justice. There's a lot of different books on the religion of philosophy, the metaphysics of philosophy, the physics of philosophy, and there have been some folks from Concerned Philosophers for Peace who have written articles about the peace philosophy in Star Trek, but I wanted to have a more sustained kind of investigation. So this is where that book comes from. It's really just a blending together of a lifetime of fandom and scholarly inquiry in a certain area of philosophy. And I was just so grateful that I had a love with something that could bring all of this together.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Orosco, for sharing some of your background, your motivations for writing a book about Star Trek's philosophy of peace and justice. Let's get right into the philosophy. Can you give us an overview of the book? Just tell us a little about the main idea of the book and how you go about presenting it.
Yeah, sure. I mean, as I hinted, I think that there's a couple of things that I think that Star Trek tries to do as part of the Star Trek universe, as part of this main message that it's trying to get across. It has a vision of humanity, and it has a vision of humanity moving into the future that I find compelling and interesting to pay attention to. I think the image of humanity that Star Trek has is what we might roughly call a humanist one. It's a vision of humanity learning from its mistakes and progressing forward by learning from those mistakes. So we're a species that's capable of learning from our mistakes, using our reason, using our judgment and our creativity to work together better, to learn from the mistakes of history, to build bigger and better institutions. And ultimately, if we can realize that about ourselves, we can progress into a utopian future, something like the vision of the Federation in Star Trek. And so I think that Star Trek tries to remind us of what we are as human beings fundamentally, which is a rational and primarily cooperative, creative species, that we have been able to overcome great evils throughout history, particularly by learning how to work better together and looking back and realizing, oh, we don't want to do that again. That was awful. That was a horrible period in our history. I follow in some sense the kind of theory of history in Star Trek that comes from the political theorist George Gonzalez, who's written a little bit about this. He sort of shows that in the Star Trek universe, there's this kind of progress of humanity learning through history from the period of the American Civil War, from World War II. And then the backstory canon of Star Trek is we've learned how to deal with World War III, and we have created a world in the Federation of the 23rd, 24th, and so forth centuries. We are a species that no longer fights with ourselves because of scarcity of resources, because of things like racism, sexism, homophobia, so forth. We've learned how to be able to work through all of those kinds of conflicts, to enjoy and not just tolerate, but encourage and bring out the differences in ourselves, to be able to better ourselves and to explore the universe and to find out all of its mysteries. So I think that fundamentally at the heart of Star Trek is this kind of a vision that Gene Roddenberry called IDIC, right? Infinite diversity and infinite combinations. Roddenberry really believed that it was through this appreciation of all of our differences and our celebration of our differences that we become better, smarter, more creative, more capable as human beings. And so what I did in the book is to sort of explore how that kind of picture of humanity and history in Star Trek is played out in a variety of different episodes, and how that relates to topics in peace studies. And the idea is that peace studies as a discipline has always been interested not only in understanding how the world works and how it functions and what the problems are in it, but it has a normative dimension to it too, which is we want to understand the problems of the world in order to be able to improve it, to make it better, to make it more humane, to make it more just. And so I saw that there was a lot of convergence between the aspirations of Star Trek towards building a better future and the aspirations of peace and justice studies, which has been since 1948 to build a better world, to learn how to overcome devastating war and devastating ideologies, authoritarian fascism and so forth, and to really be committed to something like the hope of the United Nations in 1948, which was to build a better world for peace and democracy in which the inherent dignity of all human beings is recognized. How do we build something like that? And I think that that sort of really chimes well with the kinds of hopes of Star Trek. And so when I wanted to sort of show, how Star Trek can help us to think about peace and justice studies because of this sort of parallel vision of hope. But as I was looking at Star Trek too, I realized this has some pretty big lessons, I think, for how we do peace and justice studies. Like I said, Star Trek has a perspective. It's not just something that we can use to illustrate certain ideas that already exist that are being created by scholars and politicians and so forth, but it has a message that says, hey, if you want to build a better world, you're going to have to do and think in these kinds of ways. And quite frankly, I think that these are lessons that those of us who are in the field of peace studies can learn from. So there's criticisms about our world that Star Trek makes that say, you have to deal with this if this is in fact something that you want to build into the future. So there's extensive chapters of the chapter that I focus on particularly in thinking about this is the critical race theory, is that if we really want to build a peaceful, more just, humane future, we have to take seriously the legacies of white supremacy. And that means having to deal with the legacies of colonialism and capitalism. And if we don't talk about those things together and criticize them, then any kind of more peaceful and just future, apart from Star Trek, is going to be very difficult, if not impossible.
Thank you for that overview. It's a wonderful book, and there are many rich chapters, and impossible to talk about briefly. But that was a nice introduction. We are convening this event on April 4th, which is the anniversary of the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. I wonder if you could take a few minutes and talk about the connections that you make in the book between Star Trek and King, between King's philosophy of nonviolence, and the way you present the philosophy of peace in an anti-racist perspective.
Yeah, thank you for reminding us of that anniversary of his assassination today from 1968. So Dr. King has always been a formative figure in all of my work. I think that some of his stuff really deeply impacted me as a graduate student. In fact, reading your book, Greg, about the philosophy of Martin Luther King Jr. set me on a path, I think, of a lifetime of study of King. And so to thank you for your work in this field as well. So I think that the short of it is, what I was really excited to do is to realize, I've always been a scholar of King, but then I started to realize that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was a science fiction nerd. And in fact, he was a Trekkie. So I talk about this really well-known story for most Trekkies, but the story that Nichelle Nichols told when she met Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. During the beginning of the second season of Star Trek. Nichelle Nichols, who plays Lieutenant Uhura, the communications officer on the Enterprise, she had a feeling at the end of the first season that she wanted to leave Star Trek and go pursue her career in singing and dancing, which was what she had been doing before she got on Star Trek. So she went to Gene Roddenberry's office one day and she said, look, I would like to sort of think about quitting. And he said, oh, you can't quit. No, you can't do this. And he said, why don't you think about it for a weekend and come back and reconsider? And so she said, okay, I'll do that. She had a civil rights gala to go to in Los Angeles. I believe it was an NAACP fundraiser. And while she was there that evening, she was being shuffled around by her handlers. And one of them came up to her and said, there's a Star Trek fan who would like to meet you. Would you mind talking with him and a little bit? And she said, oh, sure, sure, sure. And so she thought, it was just going to be one of these regular sort of nerdy guys that would come along and say, hey, I really love your work. Will you sign this napkin for me? And so she was sitting there and she says she looked up and she realized that the fan was Martin Luther King Jr. And he told her, I really appreciate your work on Star Trek. I think it's great. I'm a big fan. And she says, well, I'm happy to hear that. I've actually been thinking about leaving the show. And he sat down with her and he looked at her very seriously and he said, you know what, you can't do that. And she was like, well, why not? He said, what you're doing is so important, is that the vision of the future that you are portraying by being an officer on the flagship of humanity's starship in space, that representation is so important for so many of our people, because on television, you're not a maid, you're not a servant, you're an officer who has an important task. You're representing the future of our people. You're the reason that we march in the streets. And so after that, she couldn't leave Star Trek, right? So she felt this sort of burden of representation, which she carried out. Nichelle Nichols did very well. She went on to advocate for people of color to study in STEM fields. And she worked with NASA to recruit astronauts of color. And Mae Jemison, in fact, the first African-American woman in space, claims that, it was Nichelle Nichols and her portrayal of Uhura that really motivated her to do what she did. And there's so many actresses who have talked about the important influence of Nichelle Nichols. And I think that Nichelle Nichols wouldn't have been there without Martin Luther King Jr. tying the vision of the civil rights movement and its aspirations for a different kind of integrated America with the vision of Star Trek. And so I think that this, again, for me, when I heard this story, it really tied together the threads of a lot of work that I've been doing over my lifetime, and really thinking that Star Trek has an important vision. Because if Dr. King thought it was important, then there must be really something there to pay attention to. And so, in the book, you will find a lot of discussion of Dr. King's ideas of peace and what justice requires, and particularly some of his notions of what we might call structural violence, the ways in which we create institutions that create lifetime opportunities that harm certain groups of people, perhaps inadvertently, but nonetheless still harmful. How do we deal with institutional harm and oppression in various ways? And so I think that this is important to sort of think about when we think about the sort of future of race, like what kind of world do we want to build? And the chapter on critical race theory in Star Trek in the book deals with a variety of different kinds of ideals of what kind of future we would want. Do we want a colorblind future? Do we want just a future where we tolerate each other? I think actually that Star Trek presents a vision of a sort of a much more rich kind of multicultural place in which we recognize and celebrate one another's differences and look at our differences as things that we can rely upon to help make our world richer, better, more creative, more flourishing for all of us together. So it's much more than just simply not seeing color. It's seeing color and recognizing that our differences can be important tools for getting a better future built up. And so I think that this is ultimately what Dr. King wanted as well. I think I sort of tie this to his ideas about integration in the last, say, 2 or 3 years of his life. But Dr. King is very sort of central, I think, into the ideas of what Star Trek was hoping to build. And the more and more you find out about different production staff and people like Gene Kuhn, who was one of the producers of Star Trek, you start to realize that a lot of them had connections to various figures in the civil rights movement. I believe it was Gene Kuhn's production secretary who was a personal friend of Malcolm X. Right, and so there were these trends coming at this time that Star Trek was appealing to. So it's always been having its pulse in culture and, in some sense, the best aspirations of that culture. And so I think that it tries to work up those stories into a kind of a motivational picture of what we could aspire to. So I think that that's the sort of connection to Dr. King that I think is really important that you find throughout the book. But one thing I'll say before we switch over to another discussion, there's another anniversary that happens not today, but tomorrow. Tomorrow, April 5th, is a huge celebration in the Star Trek world. I don't know if anyone knows it. There's in Star Trek lore, April 5th, right? That's right, Jason got it. First Contact Day. April 5th, 2063. is celebrated in Star Trek, in the Star Trek universe, as the day in which humanity first met an alien species, and it set the course for the development of the Federation. But before that is this really dystopian period of eugenics wars, genocide, almost extinction of the human race through thermonuclear war. It's a really, for Star Trek, the next 40 years or so for us are going to be really awful. It's a really dystopian future that we look forward to in the near future. But at the end of that period in 2063 is the awakening of humanity towards the stars. And it's one of those moments, I think, that I talk about where if we can learn from the past, if we can learn to see how to learn from history and learn about what we are as human beings, as smart, capable, creative, cooperative beings, then April 5th, 2063 is a monumental moment in human history that will take us somewhere that we've never been before. And so I always like to celebrate that day because, again, it's one of those moments of real hope, I think, to have, and particularly at a dystopian time in which we live now, to think about maybe there's a future for us that's going to be so much brighter and grander, full of more possibilities. I think that's also worth celebrating.
Well, thank you for that, Dr. Orosco. Thank you for helping us to memorialize Dr. King's assassination, his life, and to connect it to an anniversary of hope as well. Well, I've read the book. I've got it on Kindle. I like Kindles because you can do the search and text kind of thing. And I've watched a lot of Star Trek, and I've read a lot of philosophy. So your book does a great job of bringing the two together. We're honored today that we are joined by Andrew Fiala, a professor of philosophy at California State University, Fresno. Dr. Fiala is a well-respected philosopher of peace and nonviolence. He has written about 10 books, including a forthcoming book on tyranny. Welcome, Dr. Fiala.
Hi everyone from California. Glad to be here.
So you have been reading Dr. Orosco's new book, and we want to hear what you think. But first, would you please share with us a little bit about your background, how you came to have a lifetime interest in the philosophy of peace and nonviolence?
Yeah, thank you, Greg, and thank you for organizing this, and thank you, Joseph, for this really fun and insightful book. It's great. I mean, I just really enjoyed reading it. So you have to get a hold of this, folks out there. I've been working on this stuff for my whole life. And when you had said that, this is the anniversary of King's death, I was a baby in Memphis when King was assassinated. And so that's part of kind of my family history, is to think about, violence in the aftermath. And then I've had the good fortune to work with people like Joseph Orosco, who I'm not only a Star Trek fan, but I'm a Orosco fan. So, I've learned a whole heck of a lot from him, including, I don't think you mentioned this in your introduction, but he wrote this really great book on Cesar Chavez, who is one of our local heroes here in the Central Valley of California. And, that's another really insightful book. So, I mean, all these, this is all important stuff. And I think, in our world, in our country, at this time, we need to be thinking much more carefully about peace and nonviolence and justice.
Thank you for that, Dr. Fiala. Do you want to talk a little bit more about growing up in Memphis?
Well, the family, I'm white middle class American, and the stories we heard about this from my parents and my relatives kind of reiterated the white supremacist narrative. And folks in my family are still working through that lens. And so it's sort of, you discover the problems when you live within them of white supremacy and sexism and racism. I mean, so I come at this from a different angle, having grown up in a kind of, be honest about this, white supremacist household, and have learned from a lot of people like Joseph Orosco how to think differently about these things. So we can make progress. I think that's the good news is, generational projects actually can bear fruit.
Thank you for sharing that background with us. Now let's get right into Dr. Orosco's book. Are you a Trekkie?
Yeah, and there's generational issues here. So I was, I discovered Star Trek in the 1980s, watching it on midnight reruns in Southern California. So it came on across Southern California at midnight. There was the original series, and then that hooked me during college. And then, Jean-Luc Picard and that generation of Star Trek. And I have to admit, I kind of lost track recently. But Orosco, again, he introduces us to, across the generations of Star Trek, I will say. And the Voyager is kind of as late as I got. Although when the movies started coming out, my wife loves the reboot, right? So the the new universe, there's fun stuff there. And yeah, I've enjoyed it for the last 40 years.
So, and clearly you're a philosopher. So what's your overall impression of the book? In your opinion, what's the most interesting thing that this book offers you as a philosopher of peace and nonviolence?
Well, this, and it's partly Joseph Orosco. He is a cutting, critical, radical thinker. Like, Joseph approaches things from a quite radical point of view, but his spirit is so kind and hopeful. It's sort of like, he lays out some criticism and then brings it together with like, yeah, but human beings can do better, so that, one of the things you see in his writing in this book is that, critical spirit, but with kindness and gentleness and hope alongside of it. So, and that's always been my experience, Joseph, of, hearing you speak at the APA or at, various conferences that we've been involved with is, the standpoint from which he comes is, it cuts as deep as possible to the roots of injustice and racism and inequality, etc. But then, like, as he said in the introduction, his deep belief is that human beings are a rational, cooperative species. So you put those two things together, and you get the criticism, and you get hope. And so I think one of the best things about the book is his focus on Star Trek as a critical utopia, not a dystopian future. Right there's a great hope for humanity that comes through Star Trek and through Orosco's recounting of it. So I find that to be super useful these days, because there's a kind of doom and gloom in the world. We feel like things are falling apart, and Joseph gives us a recipe to put them back together a little bit, after they fall apart.
Thank you. But as a philosopher, of course, you would also have questions and concerns. It's not often that we have the author in the room when we have questions or concerns about a book that we're reading. So if you had to pick your most pressing question or concern, what would it be? What would you like to ask Dr. Orosco to explain or clarify for you?
Yeah, so, the one significant worry I have about the Star Trek future is that it is militaristic and hierarchical. And so it's the uniforms, it's the rank, the kind of meritocracy connected to a starship that is loaded with photon torpedoes, right? So one of the things I would love to hear more about is, ideas connected to the Gandhi King tradition and questions about active strategies of nonviolence, civil disobedience, all of the the playbook of the Gandhi King tradition. I don't know if I see that so much in Star Trek. I kind of see Star Trek, it's a bit of a few ultimatums, and at the end of the day, maybe we're going to load our photon torpedoes and blow someone up. So, that's a worry I have about using Star Trek as a jumping off point for this. But, and Orosco tells a story where, including within the Federation, how the meritocracy then is multicultural and inclusive. And I think that's super important. I think that's really important. So I guess, one of the things I would love to hear more about is, and again, maybe I just haven't looked in the right place in the Star Trek universe. But that infinite diversity and infinite combinations vision, how is that connected to a Gandhi King strategies of active nonviolence, and so on? So I would love to hear more about that.
Dr. Orosco?
Yeah, this is a great question. And so I think that, there are certain things about the Star Trek universe that I think are kind of curious, because you're right. Most of the stories take place on these settings, these ships that are sent out by a multi-species federation, right, through Starfleet. And there's a uniform structure and there's a command structure and everything. And so it's very hierarchical, very sort of top heavy. Quite frankly, not a structure that I think is always really great for democratic deliberation. So I'm not a big supporter of the sort of pyramid sort of structure of hierarchy that sometimes gets represented. But the science fiction author David Brennan and I had a conversation once, because I expressed to him this kind of worry about the militarism of Star Trek. And he suggested to me that, he says, there are varieties of military. So he said Star Trek is the kind of flavor that you have in Star Trek is less like, the Army or the Marines. It's more like the Coast Guard, he said, right? Where you have people on ships and it's much more sort of fluid camaraderie, and there's less of a sort of a kind of militaristic or imperialistic, violent kind of tendency. It's about providing assistance and aid and service to people. But he did say this. He said, but really, if you look at it, there's so many ways in which the structure of Star Trek, in terms of the starship leadership, that's so different than a lot of other kinds of ways in which we make decisions nowadays. And so, what I've been emphasizing to people a lot of times is that the Star Trek, what's a key scene in almost all Star Trek series, going back to the original pilot from 1964, is the moment in which everyone sits around a table and has a conversation about how they're going to problem solve together. So it's in the briefing room, or someone has to have a conversation about this or that, and all these minds come together and they break down problems and they talk about what they're going to do. Ultimately, there's one person that's going to make a decision, the captain usually, but you see the process of working together to solve problems. And this is even true up to modern day Star Trek and Discovery and Picard. My criticism of Star Trek, the new Trek, is this: I wish they would give people a chair when they're sitting around to make these kinds of problems, because in the older Star Trek, they're always sitting around a table thinking together. In modern Star Trek, they're always standing around looking at each other, which I find really unnatural and not a really pleasant way to make decisions together. But right, so I think that there are ways in which Star Trek tries to show us that, yes, there are glimpses of this kind of militarism, but it's a very sort of different kind of view. And, throughout Star Trek, there's all these kinds of emphases that Starfleet is not military, right? We're explorers, not military. We are out here to find new worlds, not to be conquerors. And various ways in which they play with stories about like different alternative universes where Starfleet is a conquering military force, and how that's really different from what they do in the Starfleet Prime universe. So I think that you're right. There could be stories told in the Star Trek universe that don't have to focus on Starfleet. And I really, my big criticism of Star Trek is that I wish that there were other these kinds of stories. But I think what's interesting is when Star Trek has sort of tried to tell stories of civilian life, or tries to show ways in which the Federation and Starfleet and its sort of military structures fall apart. Or don't work. I'll just mention this. There's a storyline that begins in the Star Trek The Next Generation about the Maquis. These are civilians that get stranded on a border territory between the Federation and the Cardassian Empire. Cardassian, not Kardashian. though both of them are toxically evil, right? But the Cardassians and the Federation have had these wars and border skirmishes, and they create a kind of a neutral zone. And there's all these planets in between with people, and they get tossed around by both of these powers in a kind of Cold War realist way that leaves some of the civilians out in the cold, and they eventually form a kind of a survival terrorist force to defend themselves in this area. And there's storylines, and the whole sort of Voyager storyline is about a group of Maquis. Most of them are people who were in the Federation, who left the Federation because they felt that the Federation was not living up to its ideals, and they created this sort of civilian pseudo-anarchist kind of communes. I think those stories would be really interesting to tell about the Maquis. The Maquis, I think, however, all got wiped out at the end of DS9, at the end of the Dominion War. So I think that those people met a tragic end. But to speak about Gandhi and King, I think that what I tried to do in the book is I've tried to show that there are a variety of ways in which Star Trek approaches conflict and war. And so, yes, there's a lot of weaponry, there's a lot of sophisticated combat possible in the Star Trek universe, but it's always thought of as a last ditch measure. So Star Trek, I think Starfleet tries to follow very much to just war traditions, right? Violence is only used in self-defense, only for a just cause. And, you know, peace is always the thing to try to achieve, but diplomacy is always the way to go. And the stories so often in Star Trek are about how something could have gone very much awry, very violent. There could have been an all-out war, but it was through some kind of realization of a deeper source of conflict, of a deeper problem that needs to be addressed rather than solving it through violence. And I think that this is the Gandhi King message, is that when you're thinking about an eruption of violence or a spark of, you know, what you call, Andy, spectacular violence, there's always a deeper sort of cause. And I think that Star Trek has been really good over the years of getting us to focus on those deeper causes, to think about what might be structurally going on that leads people to think that violence is the only outcome. Or, you know, my favorite sort of trope of Star Trek is that it always, I'm not sure if there's a notion of evil in Star Trek. I've been trying to think about this a lot, particularly because Gene Roddenberry was very concerned about how villains are portrayed. And so in the original Star Trek, there's so many stories in which a villain is originally portrayed and gets people into trouble, does awful things. And then the story gets us to try to understand why that villain is the way that they are. The classic sort of storyline about this is The Devil in the Dark, where from the original series, where they beam down to a planet that's a mining colony. They're being eaten by some kind of monster creature, and they don't know what it is, so it blends all these kinds of horror aspects to it. And they realize finally that there's this monster in the mines that's killing all the human beings, and they're trying to figure out whether they should destroy it. And it turns out, because Spock mind melds with it, that it's a mama, and the miners have been killing all of its babies, and it's only been acting out of self-defense. And this changes the dynamic. This changes how they perceive this creature and what's possible from it. And that storyline is repeated over and over and over and over again in Star Trek stories for 60 years or so. And so I think that this is one of those kinds of things that Star Trek is trying to always tell us: look underneath the surface of people, look underneath the surface of events, and realize that destroying the villain, crushing the enemy, is not always the right move, and that often that kind of impulse can be a mistake and can lead to greater trouble. And so I think that sort of message is the deeper sort of Gandhi King message. So I think that Star Trek is more committed to that than anything, despite the fact that there's a lot of captains and lieutenants and things like that. Something that I love the uniforms, right? I don't know if I could deal with that myself.
Thank you. Thank you for that wonderful answer. And thank you for the excellent question, Dr. Fiala. We would like to introduce one of our colleagues from Colorado. Dr. Jennifer Kling is Assistant Professor of Philosophy and director of the Center for Legal Studies at the University of Colorado at Colorado Springs. She has written books about philosophy and war refugees, protest, pacifism, and feminism. She currently serves as executive director of the Concerned Philosophers for Peace, who met on her campus a couple of years ago. Welcome, Dr. Kling.
Hi, thank you for having me. I'm super excited to be here and talk about Jose's awesome book.
I know you've been reading Dr. Orosco's book, and we want to hear what your thoughts are. But first, would you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you came to have an interest in writing books about refugees, protest, and feminism?
Sure. So, as you said, right, I'm at University of Colorado, Colorado Springs. And I started working on war and peace in graduate school. And really, I started writing about sort of refugees and then protest, right, which some people argue is almost always a lead up to war, right, whereas other people conceptualize it very differently. And feminism, because I started realizing that these are the voices that are not getting talked about in war theory often, right? So often in war theory, refugees are referred to as collateral damage, right? And that's a real way of taking away their humanity, and of just not recognizing that refugees are persons, right? Who've sort of been thrown into these kinds of situations against their will. And so I just sort of recognized that there sort of was a gap in the philosophical literature and discussion around these issues. And I decided that I should fill that gap. And also I think it's really important when we're talking about these large scale issues to really think about the people, right? And to recognize that even though we're talking about big structures, right? About the future, right? About these big systems, at the end of the day, we're also just talking about humans, and sometimes non-human persons, right? As the case may be. But sort of it's all people, and that's what we need to be talking about. So yeah.
And let me just ask you quickly, why did you mention non-human?
Oh yeah. So I often say this because sometimes I say humans, right? And then people are like, but Star Trek, right? So speaking of First Contact Day, right? So we meet a lot of non-humans in Star Trek and in various stories, right? That are really all stories about ourselves, but we like to pretend they're stories about other creatures. And so I always try to be careful to distinguish between humans, which seems to like indicate a certain kind of biology, and then persons, which indicates a certain kind of moral status, right? And care and flourishing. So just trying to be careful. I'm such a philosopher.
Cool. And given your philosophical interests, what did you find most appealing about the book?
Yeah, absolutely. So the way I describe my own work is that I do applied political philosophy. So I try to think hard about politics and war and peace and international relations, but always in an applied context. So I'd like to look at sort of things that are happening in the actual world and how we should talk about them. And so I loved two things about the book, perhaps unsurprisingly. The first is that I really love how it gives us a kind of roadmap, right? So a lot of fantasy, science fiction sort of gives us a possible world, right? It gives us this picture of what we could be like or what we might be like if we make sort of the right decisions, these kinds of things. What I love about the book is that José points out that we have a roadmap for getting there, right? Because Star Trek doesn't only give us a possible future, it also sort of says, and here's how you do that, right? And that's a large part of what the book is about. And as an applied political philosopher, I'm always in the market for a roadmap, right? Tell me not only what I'm supposed to do, but like tell me how to do it, because I think that's really important. So I loved that about the book. And then in line with that, I actually really liked how the book points out that Star Trek is a critical utopia in more than one way. And I think one of the things that I do love about Star Trek itself and that the book draws out is that the folks in Star Trek make mistakes. it's not a perfect utopia, right? It's not that everybody is wise and perfect, right? As Jose was saying earlier, right? It's a bunch of people like sitting around or standing around making decisions, and sometimes they make the wrong decision, right? Like things go wrong. And so the roadmap isn't a roadmap that says you must be perfect and that's how you get to this great future. The roadmap is, hey, you can make some mistakes, things can go wrong, and things could still go okay. It's the idea that there's a way to come back from your errors, which I think is a real thing that's missing from our actual political discussions today, right? People never give anybody else a way back. Once you've messed up, you're out forever. And I think one of the things that the book draws out is that there are ways of coming back from errors and mistakes and still moving forward in a good way. So I loved both of those things.
All right. Well, thanks for sharing what you like most about the book. Now, what would you like to ask the author?
Yeah. I'm so excited to ask you this question. So perhaps unsurprisingly, I want to talk a little bit about the Prime Directive, because of course the Prime Directive of Star Trek, right, is that you don't interfere, right? But of course, Star Trek is also the story of interference. It's the story of Starfleet, which has this Prime Directive and seems to be mostly concerned with ignoring it in certain kinds of ways. And so I want to ask about the Prime Directive specifically as it relates to refugees and displaced persons, because I think one of the things that's true about Star Trek in its various iterations is that it has this sort of complicated relationship with refugees, with displaced persons, with oppressed persons, right? Whether they're considered as individuals or as a group, right? So this is how the Prime Directive relates, right? They always meet sort of groups of folks who are oppressed or without a space. And the question is, what do you do, right? Do you leave them to their fate or do you help? And I think this actually, in an interesting way, right, it mirrors the complicated relationship with refugees and oppressed groups and displaced persons that we actually have today, kind of across the globe, right? We often don't quite know what to do with folks who are in this position. And so I think I kind of wanted to ask about your analysis of Star Trek as this kind of critical utopia. Can it help us make sense of this really complicated relationship between non-interference and interference, and how we should handle the fact that folks are often without a place to go and without a place to live, and what we should do in response?
Yeah, this was a question that really stumped me, and I had to go back and do some more research afterwards and thinking about this. So one thing to say about the Prime Directive, the sort of main this main feature of Starfleet, the Prime Directive, for those of you who are not Trekkies, is this kind of directive. It's supposed to be one of the most important rules for Starfleet officers. But the problem is that it changes over 60 years about what exactly it is and what exactly it means. And so on the one hand, right early on, the Prime Directive said there should be no interference by Starfleet officers with civilizations that are not warp capable species. So if you don't have a certain kind of level of technology, don't interfere, don't come down as aliens from space, because they won't, the idea is you'll screw up their development. And you should only really make first contact with species that have the ability to travel faster than light. But then it changes largely through, I think, the next generation to don't interfere, broadly speaking. And I think there's been a lot written about this. I think partly that the changes with this particular kind of view was a kind of recognition by Star Trek that they didn't want Starfleet to be a colonizing imperialistic power. They wanted to distinguish the exploration of space by humanity through the Federation to be different than the kind of exploration that has taken place in human history. And that means having ethical principles and restraints and guidelines about how to interact with other species. Now, I mean, the history of this actually does go back all the way to early European imperialism. I mean, the Spanish had all sorts of rules about colonization of the Americas, and it didn't stop them from being utterly immoral and devastating the Americas. And so the existence of rules themselves don't necessarily mean that things are going to have a much better outcome. But nonetheless, right, I think that was the sort of impulse behind the Prime Directive, is to think about how we can, go to strange new worlds and meet new civilizations without being conquerors, coming as explorers and potential friends. So, and the tension in so many of the, throughout the Star Trek universe is, how do different captains deal with that kind of restriction? And very often, right, there's like debates online about who is the greatest violator of Prime directives, which I think it turns out, actually, it's not Kirk. I think it's Janeway. I think Janeway is the one who violates it the most. But in the book, I talk about the ways in which there are discussions about intervention. And so I tie this to questions about humanitarian intervention in the real world. Right? Since the 2000s, we've had conversations about, is it ever appropriate for a country to intervene in another country if there are human rights violations going on, violations of war, right? What's the responsibility of the global community to react when there are human rights violations in some country or set of countries? This is a big question that, we're dealing with now, and trying to figure out, like, how do we understand these and what are our moral obligations? And so I think that Star Trek has had these kinds of discussions going back to the 1960s. I think, particularly, I talk about an episode, The Apple, in the original series, which the Enterprise beams down to a planet, and it's populated by this indigenous group that is seemingly very peaceful, living in an utter utopia, but they serve this computer that keeps everything going for them, but it also keeps them at a certain level of development. And so they have been living there for tens of thousands of years, but they don't seem to be progressing. And so there's this really, again, a conversation. There's a conversation between Kirk, McCoy, and Spock, where they have this discussion about whether or not it's the obligation of the Enterprise to intervene in that situation, given the Prime Directive about non-interference. But at the same time, what are their moral obligations to humanoids who seem to be in service to a tyrannical machine? And I love that scene because Kirk is listening to McCoy and Spock go back and forth about what they should do and whether it's ever appropriate to intervene. And Kirk at one point says, "Well, gentlemen, enough of this philosophical discussion," right? He says it right off, and he says, "We're going to need to make a decision." But I appreciate the storytelling where you lay out issues and you realize, oh, this is complicated. And what I do in my chapters, I talk about how that sort of plays out in many different episodes in Star Trek, that sort of conversation of grappling with these different kinds of moral obligations, these duties that are not all easy to try to figure out, and how do we perhaps negotiate them? Was it the right decision to destroy the computer to allow those people to be able to progress? Was it the right decision, or was it an imperialistic decision by the part of Starfleet? I think there are ways in which we might be able to talk about that. I use actually Martha Nussbaum's capability theories to make sense of that. But I think that I appreciate the setting for that kind of discussion, to be able to talk about that. It allows us to be able to review in peace studies, what are the different resources that we have to think about these, which are real life issues, and Star Trek is analogizing those. About refugees. So, I think that Star Trek portrays refugees in a variety of different interesting ways. But I think most significantly in the most recent series, Picard, which perhaps many people have not seen, right? A lot of this new Trek nowadays is on Paramount Plus, right? The streaming service, and is exclusive to that. So you have to pay now to watch Star Trek. But the first season of Star Trek Picard portrays a really huge refugee crisis. It's a big part of the storyline, in fact. And so the storyline is that the sun of around the home planet of the Romulans is going supernova. This was something that you saw in the 2009 feature film rebooted by J.J. Abrams. It does take place in the Prime universe. And so the storyline is that the sun is going to go supernova. It's going to destroy the planet of Romulus and Remus, the planets where the Romulans come from. And so the question is like what to do with them as a result of this catastrophe. And Jean-Luc Picard decides that he wants to try to mount one of the most massive refugee resettlement projects in the galaxy's history. And because of a variety of realpolitik matters, the Federation decides not to assist the Romulans in moving everyone off planet, billions of people we're talking about, and essentially allows a lot of people to die and sort of leaves the Romulans to their own to deal with the destruction of their homeworld. And so Jean-Luc Picard is so disgusted by the decision that Starfleet made in this that he resigns his commission and goes into retirement. And Picard season 1 begins with him living his life as this bitter ex-admiral who sort of burned all his bridges to Starfleet because it made these bad decisions, what he considers to be immoral decisions, letting those people die. And so he talks about how he failed those people personally and how Starfleet went on an immoral path. There's a lot of real world, real life parallels here. I think, what's interesting to me is I realized that the Canadian Museum of Human Rights has done extensive sort of discussion about the ways in which Star Trek and how it deals with refugees and these kinds of issues mirrors things like what happened in Rwanda. So there used to be a display at the Canadian Museum of Human Rights about Star Trek and refugees and resettlement and all this, which I found very interesting. But they point out that, what's going on in something like Star Trek Picard is the way in which the world community dealt with Rwanda and the catastrophe there, the genocide. It sort of stood back. And then afterwards, people realized we made a big moral mistake. This was a grave error on the part of the global community to not do something about this and let, a million or so people get killed. And so the Star Trek sort of mirrors the kind of conflict about how really difficult this is. But I think it sort of gives the impression that if we don't do something, then we are in fact doing something really highly immoral. But I think it comes down to something that you said before, that we're dealing with people. It's not just numbers and it's not just billions of statistics and so forth. It's real people. And so, the way that I would end this sort of discussion about refugees is to focus on this Next Generation episode called Journey's End. Which is one of my favorite episodes. This is about the neutral zone between the Cardassians and the Federation. There's a planet in the middle of this neutral zone between these two empires called Dorvan 5, I think, and it's a place in which refugees from Earth, that is, settlers from Earth, hundreds of years ago, escaped Earth to try to settle there, and they're all Native Americans. So Native Americans left Earth to settle this planet to be free of white settler colonialism on Earth. And they've created this community on this planet, which is now, used to be a Federation planet, will now, because of the treaty negotiations, become a Cardassian planet. And Picard is sent there, ordered to go resettle everyone, to take everyone off planet. And this group of Native Americans say, look, no, you're not going to do this to us. This is not the history that's going to play out now. This is how our people have been treated by powers all along, and we're not going to let it happen again. And he has strict orders from Starfleet to get these people off by any means necessary. And the Cardassians are like, get these people off or else we're going to deal with them. And it's this really sort of tense situation about like, what do we do with these people who are stuck in the middle of these two massive powers fighting over hegemony in this region? What are the lives of these people going to be like? And there's a lot of sort of kind of sci-fi Deus a machina kinds of things that sort of intervene, that sort of diffuse the conflict. But there's a scene in there, this long story short, to get to this point. Picard is talking with the Cardassian commander, and he says, look, you know, if we don't figure this out, there's going to be a war. How do you feel about this? And the Cardassian commander says, look, I can't guarantee that if you leave, these people are going to be treated well, but I will try my best to make sure that they're treated as best that they can. I don't want another war. I have 4 sons. I've lost 3 of them in a war. I don't want to lose the last one. And so ultimately, right, there's peace, right? It's actually just absence of conflict. It's not real peace. It's what we call a negative peace. There's negative peace in the neutral zone between the Federation and Cardassia, because the players recognize the human costs. And I think that that's a real moment. I think that's a real moment about how human beings make decisions dealing with questions about peace and justice, that often it's not statistics, it's not data sets, it's not policy analysis that really drives peace a lot of the times. It's when human beings really understand the costs personally and to themselves. It's through those personal narratives and stories. And so I think that Star Trek kind of hits home on that point, is that we need to be able to hear and tell those kinds of stories when we're seeing, you know, massive powers about to go to war with one another. And so this makes me, you know, I was thinking about this episode, I was watching it the other day, and I was thinking about what's going on in Ukraine, where this country is being rendered apart. And the question is, do we intervene? There's going to be a big war if we get involved. It reminded me so much of the discussions between the Federation and the Cardassians in that episode about what to do, because we know that if we get into this right here, it's going to be awful for everybody, perhaps deadly for billions of people. And so how do we think about that? And it was coming back to that question of the Cardassian commander thinking about his family. And so the question is, I think always for peace and justice studies, is how do we highlight the human costs of war and injustice and oppression without it sort of just going over people's heads, becoming statistics, becoming stories. And I think that that's what's really rich about Star Trek, is it tries to portray and to dramatize these kinds of moral conflicts and costs, gives us ways of being able to explore these tensions with stories that are moving, that are complex, and sometimes get solved, sometimes don't. In fact, that piece breaks down in the Star Trek universe, and that's where the Maquis come from, because the Cardassians don't honor their treaties with those peoples, and they have to fight back, forming a sort of a terrorist organization. So that storyline doesn't, I mean, it shows that peace is really elusive, but it's the human stories. And the question is, I think for us as peace scholars, is trying to figure out, like, how are we able to get people to elicit moral sympathy, moral empathy, so that we can make change. And I don't frequently think that happens through the kind of really hard political science kinds of ways of thinking. I think it's through human narrative.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you for that beautiful answer, and for the way the answer connected to one of the issues that is on everybody's mind today. And so thank you, Dr. Kling, for the wonderful question. We had a question in the chat from Judy, but I've been chatting with Judy in the background, and she says that your answer to Dr. Kling pretty much took care of that. So we're going to go on to Maurice Hamington, who has his hand up, and we're going to ask Maurice, could you go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question?
Yeah. Hi, Jose. Brilliant presentation. I have to admit, I don't have the book, it's on order, but I'm looking forward to it. And your scholarship is always spot on. I love listening to you. I always learn so much when you speak. And this is kind of a follow-up to Jen's question and what you were just saying. I want to propose, and I don't know how much you deal with this in the book, but I want to propose that a, there's a lot of Star Trek's moral thinking resonates strongly with feminist care ethics. In the negotiation around the stories you were just telling, the empathy, making the connections, it seems to me that there is the prime directive, there's all the rules, there's the, there's the hierarchy and all that kind of thing that's out there. But what makes the stories interesting is the negotiation of the reality, whether whether it coincides with the rules or or whether it doesn't. Again, thinking back to the story in The Next Generation, that one episode where Data violates the Prime Directive and talks to a child on a planet that's getting destroyed, and Picard says something like, well, now that that voice is no longer abstract anymore, it's a real voice, and we have to respond to it. I'm also fascinated by the ethics of Star Trek, but I think there's a lot in there that speaks to feminist care ethics, and I'd just like to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, thank you, Maurice. It's good to see you. So I think you're right. That episode is really great in talking, it's sort of trying to show that so much about what matters has to do with that kind of human connection and the creation of conditions for empathy and feeling together. That's so much of Star Trek stories all together. I mean, it goes back, I think, to one of Gene Roddenberry's favorite episodes, which was The Devil in the Dark, the one I mentioned about that creature, the Horta, where its babies were being killed by the miners. And it was when Spock was able to make the mind melt and to feel its pain, to feel its horror at the loss of its children. That's what really switches the storyline, is that sort of empathic connection that gets made through Spock, because beforehand it was a monster, the devil in the dark. Afterwards it became a sentient creature, a mother, as a matter of fact. Right. You'll be happy. I know that you do a lot of work on the philosophy of Jane Addams. I really say that what's important about Star Trek is I think it takes seriously Jane Addams' point of view that the absence of conflict, negative peace, is not enough to really talk about full peace. So there's an extended discussion about Jane Addams and her notion of positive peace. And I say that I think Star Trek is really trying to shoot to try to get us to understand that that's really what peace is, a world that's devoted to human rights, to economic security, to living sustainably and in communication with non-human persons, and a better connection to the natural world. And I think that Star Trek learns that from something like Jane Addams. Let me just say one other thing. I think that I know I've talked on Facebook, I think, with you before, but again, going back to the original series, which is, of course, my Wilwell. There's an episode called The Empath, which I really recommend to people to check out. The crew of the Enterprise, the trio, McCoy, Spock, and Kirk, beam down to a planet to investigate loss of communication with a Federation science outpost, and they find that the two scientists that were there have been tortured and killed, and they're trying to figure out, like, who did this to them. And they then run across a young woman who is mute. She can't speak, and it's not clear why she's there. But they are then confronted by a couple of aliens who tell them that that the crew must then face some trials, and if they survive, then they can go, but they might likely die. So, right, the long story short, what happens is it turns out that the planet that they're on is about to be destroyed by a supernova, and these aliens have the power to save the young woman's species, but they wanted to decide whether or not she was worthy of being saved by them. And the way that they decided that is that her species has empathic abilities to be able to not only understand and feel the pain of others, but actually to take on the suffering of others. So she's able to touch a person who has been harmed and heal them by taking on their pain. And so the test was the aliens were testing her to decide whether she would be willing to sacrifice herself, to show so much compassion that she would be willing to die by saving the crew of the Enterprise, who've been tortured almost to the point of death by these aliens. It's actually pretty grim. It's a pretty grim storyline. But the crew is able to convince her after they're almost killed by these aliens that she showed a willingness to put herself out there to care for others. And so when I teach the classes about feminist care ethics in my Star Trek class, I use that episode to talk about the sort of boundaries of care, like what exactly does care require of us? And was the expectation that you should have to be willing to put your own life at risk in order to care for others? Is that really the moral boundary or not? And the crew of the Enterprise convinces the aliens that it's not, that it's enough to show that she was willing to bring herself very close to this and that they should learn from her about how to care. But the whole episode is, what are the requirements of care? But I think that those storylines are all throughout Star Trek as well. The questions about like really honing in these capacities of human beings. So our capacity of human beings is not just rational, it's not just scientific, it's not just that we can build fancy technological abilities, but more and more, over and over, the stories are about like, what are our emotional reactions? What are our attitudes towards the other? How do we react to various stress situations? Do we react with empathy? Do we react with mercy? Do we forgive? There's so many of these stories over and over again. And so I think that part of the story of Star Trek is that our ability as human beings is not just in our technological know-how, but it's also in the development of our moral attitudes. And there's progress to be shown in the ways in which we've become better human beings through moral progress. As well. And if we don't take that seriously, then we are in fact doomed. And I think that this is a message that comes, from a lot of different peace scholars, from Einstein, and in fact, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., right? His real worry about American society in 1968 was that we had developed a society which was rich with technological developments to the point in which we could, wipe out all of humanity several times over. But he wasn't sure, Dr. King was, that we had the moral maturity, whether or not we had the moral wisdom to be able to deal with our technological development. And I think that that's a struggle that you see over and over again in the Star Trek universe.
Wonderful, wonderful. Another wonderful answer, another wonderful question. I think we're about to wrap up here. We've been going for a good hour and 15 minutes. And I'd like to ask Dr. Orosco if he has any concluding thoughts at this point.
Well, let me just say, I want to thank you all for coming today and for showing up and for spending some time to talk about something that I love, Star Trek. A big shout out to the folks who had some questions. And to Andy and to Jen, to Court and to Greg for putting this together. I hope that folks who are interested in these themes can read the book. You don't have to be a Trekkie to read the book. So it helps a little bit, but what's nice about the book, I think, is that I was asked whenever I do talk about an episode to give a little bit of a brief summary. So I think that I try to explain the storylines in such a way so that you can get a sense of what the story is, and then what the moral lessons are perhaps to take from it for thinking about a better and more just and humane future. So I hope that if you're not a Trekkie, that this doesn't keep you from looking at the book. So for those of you who are peace and justice scholars, I hope that I can convince you that Star Trek is worthy of your attention, because I think that I quite honestly do believe this. I think that if we're looking for revolutionary stories at a period in time in which humanity is really in a kind of a dystopian slump, and this is not just anecdotal, and if you all doom scroll and feel bad, it's the case that a lot of people feel this way. There's a lot of survey data that indicates that. And what's really depressing is to realize that how many young people between the ages of 16 and 25 feel that humanity is doomed and that there's no really good future possible. I think that if we're looking for ways to speak about the future that are not sort of Pollyannish and in some sense also not naive about what we are as human beings, I think Star Trek can provide a really good starting point for those kinds of conversations, those kinds of stories. I know that a lot of my students sometimes when I first present Star Trek think, oh, this is corny and this is dumb, you know, this is the future. The world is not like this. They really seep in dystopian stories. But I think that after a while, once I get them to sort of see the Star Trek universe, they start to think, oh, you know, there's something here and it's kind of cool and it's very different than what they're used to in terms of storytelling now in pop culture. And so I think that, you know, whether you are a scholar, whether you are an activist in peace and justice studies, I think it really behooves us to pay attention to the narratives of our pop culture and to figure out how these structure our expectations and to fight in the field of pop culture for the imagination of the future. And I think that Star Trek is one place, not the only place, but one place in which we can make an intervention, I think, and really, I think, try to tell stories that can make a difference.
Thank you so much. That went so quickly. Can we risk Zoom crashing and just everybody unmute for a second and say thank you to Dr. Orosco?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bud.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thanks, José.
Thank you also to Dr. Fiala. Thank you, Dr. Kling. Thank you also to Court Lewis, who has hosted the Zoom session today. And everybody who has joined us today for this book launch of Star Trek's Philosophy of Peace and Justice, a Global Anti-Racist Approach by José Antonio Orozco. The book is available from Bloomsbury Press, and you can get the Kindle at Amazon. Take care, everyone. Andy can do the hand sign. I'll just say live long and prosper.